Hi, my name is Tim Cardona, and I will be doing a close reading of the letter from George Washington to Marquis de Lafayette of July 28th, 1791. George Washington of the United States of America was the leader of the armed forces in the Revolution and led them to victory over the British in the Revolution. Marquis de Lafayette was a French officer sent over by Louis XVI to assist the American cause. Lafayette took command of another army and was able to help push the British out of America in a major way, specifically when he helped the Americans out at Yorktown. Lafayette, working under Washington, led to the emergence of a lasting friendship between the two. Letters were exchanged back and forth between the two lasting friends, and Lafayette had a revolution of his own to endure in France, while the letter of July 28, 1791 was written. The letter gives some indication that the revolution in France is indeed going on concurrently with the writing of the letter. The letter mainly aims to discuss with Lafayette some issues that the French and the rest of Europe are facing due to the French Revolution, as well as contrast the state of America with that of Europe. The beginning of the letter lays a focus on the strenuous and tumultuous French Revolution that is currently being suffered through by Lafayette in France. Washington is worried about the situation that Lafayette is suffering through in France at the moment. He is expressing that concern as well as stating that what Lafayette has told him has not alleviated these fears in the slightest. Washington, however, alludes to the fact that no person in the line of work that Lafayette has chosen has to expect placing himself in mortal danger in order to properly stand by the upright view of himself, and has to place these views before his life on occasion. The quote, "But to one who engages in hazardous enterprises for the good of his country, and who is guided by pure and upright views, as I am sure is the case with you, life is but a secondary consideration." This quote properly describes the way Washington wants to state that Lafayette must put his views before his life on occasion. The tone employed by Washington in this section is a worried one, as Washington is concerned about the well-being of Lafayette due to the close friendship they had developed from their comradeship. This concern is expressed in the sarcasm and hyperbole that Washington uses to make the point of the inability of people in the government that care for their own country to ever relax. The next section of the letter commences with a discussion about the impact that the French Revolution has had on the American public. The American public is caught up in the events of the French Revolution and very involved in the affairs, because the public feels a responsibility to the French for the massive amounts of aid that the French generously gave to the Americans in their conflict with Britain. Washington alludes to the large amount of conflict and disorder in France at the moment by saying that there must be trust, that order will be reestablished, and that the threats that are currently foreboding will be diminished. The quote, "trusting that out of confusion he will produce order, and, notwithstanding the dark clouds which may threaten at present, that right will ultimately be established." In this quote, Washington's tone is more reassuring here, as he refers to the government of the French that soon they would regain their stability and that right would be again established. This assuring tone alleviates the weight that seems to constantly be placed on the shoulders of Lafayette because of the beleaguered state of his country. The following section then considers the large cities and that the disorder and violence in those places were particularly worrisome and more disastrous than in other places. These cities, such as Paris, were suffering through a particularly worrisome time from the flawed nature of the Constitution that had been laid out and created in the National Assembly. Washington recommends that the government and representative body be given an overhaul in order to bring tranquility back to the country of France. But until your Constitution is fixed, your government organized, and your representative body renovated, much tranquility cannot be expected. This quote from Washington could be an allusion to how he believes that the rest of the United States government needed to overhaul the government that they had initially created in their transfer from the flawed Articles of Confederation to the much less flawed Constitution. This provided more tranquility and stopped the unrest in the nation. The Constitutional Convention had only occurred a few years earlier in 1787. The tone of this section is more dependent on suggestion, as seen in Washington suggesting that the French create a new constitution with which to base their government on in order to please their population. In doing so, Washington believes that their population will respond in the same way that the American population responded, and become more responsive and happy from the reforms that a new constitution would entail. The preceding section of the letter from Washington correlates to his ulterior motive in sending the letter, namely that he wants to reestablish a trade that was halted between America and France. Washington does not like what the National Assembly has done or been doing in the halting of trade for products like American oil and tobacco. Washington still wants to make a profit from them. The American public is restless with these decisions by the French to hold back the trade, and Washington is implying Lafayette to pressure other French officials in order to get this back on track for the Americans. This quote from Washington properly portrays his belief that the French should go back to trading with the Americans for these specific products. The Assembly must have been occupied in very important matters, and which perhaps would not allow time for a due consideration of the subject. They will, in the moment of calm deliberation, alter it and do what is right. Lafayette that he will take care of the people breathing down his neck to force him to deal with the economic trade issues between France and America. The French nation at the time saw Americans being noncommittal in their support of the French's war against the British, because of America's need for the trade that Britain provided. Washington tries to adopt a calm and deliberate tone in these proceedings in order to provide more assurance to Lafayette, while at the same time being suggestive of what he believes the French government should do. Washington's tone being suggestive correlates to the ulterior motive of the letter and his desire to rekindle trade of tobacco and oil. The following section of the letter serves to describe the situation that America currently finds itself in. Washington describes his visit to the southern states as one in which he was quite pleased with the thriving industry and economy that was developing. He saw the development of the South into more of a manufacturing region like the North, instead of the agriculturally based region of prior. Washington also describes how citizens have a positive demeanor and belief towards the government. These citizens have a strong belief that is developed from the positives that the government has done for the citizens in the country. The next paragraph follows up with this by citing the establishment of credit as a strong mark of the people, building a sureness and assurance in the capabilities of the government. Then Washington chooses to relate this situation in America back to that of Europe by stating, while in Europe, wars or commotions seems to agitate almost every nation, peace and tranquility prevail among us. By stating thus, Washington is essentially stating that France and the rest of Europe should follow the example of America in keeping their own populations happy. America has done so through limiting the amount of wars that the nation is participating in, unlike Europe, with the many wars that are occurring due to the French Revolution that was sparked recently. Washington is giving advice in such a manner that will improve the current situation of turmoil that he is well aware is ongoing in France from the French Revolution. Washington is attempting to stabilize the situation by giving the French this advice, but attempts a more general and advisory tone in doing so. The tone employed by Washington is advisory in his delivering of advice and is more broad addressed to all of the European countries on how they can improve their situations. Washington had written this document to a close friend of his, in Lafayette, in order to discuss with Lafayette a multitude of issues, including the turmoil in Lafayette's home country of France, as well as to discuss how he can solve the issues that have plagued his country since the start of the French Revolution. Washington is trying to advise Lafayette on how to fix his home country because of the trade that the current government has ceased with the United States, as well as the close friendship that both him and Lafayette share. Most significant to Washington was his belief that the government that he had created was indeed effective in maintaining the support and happiness of the population. Washington believed he could help Lafayette do the same for France.